In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where ancient empires have risen and fallen for millennia, there exists a truth that terrifies the most powerful beings in the universe: humans don't recognize the value of things the way other species do. While alien civilizations wage wars over sacred relics and bow before ancient symbols of power, a human will look at a priceless crown and ask, "Will this hold my cooking pot steady over the fire?" This is the story of Marcus Chen, a scrap metal trader who picked up what he thought was a decorative metal ring from a crashed ship's debris field. He had no idea that the seemingly worthless piece of alien metalwork was the crown of eternal night, a relic so powerful and feared that entire star systems had been reduced to ash and wars fought over its possession. But Marcus was just trying to make his coffee, and the crown made an excellent base for his portable stove. What happens when the galaxy's most feared artifact becomes a human's camping gear? What occurs when ancient powers that have slumbered for eons wake to find their source of terror being used to heat beans? And, most importantly, what does it mean when the very object that was designed to corrupt and destroy finds itself in the hands of someone who treats it like any other tool? This is not a story about a chosen one or a prophesied hero. This is about what happens when humanity's greatest strength, our complete inability to be impressed by things that are supposed to impress us, collides with the galaxy's darkest legend. The universe is about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to an ancient evil is ignore it entirely. Marcus Chen floated through the debris field in his salvage ship, the Lucky Strike, whistling an old Earth tune while his scanner beeped steadily. The wreckage spread out before him like a mechanical graveyard, twisted metal and crystalline fragments catching the light from the nearby star. This particular debris field was the result of what the locals called the Battle of HFY Prime, though Marcus didn't pay much attention to galactic history. Wars came and went, but scrap metal was eternal. His ship's AI, a budget model he'd named Betty, chimed softly. "Marcus, the energy readings from the central wreckage are unusual." "The Galactic Salvage Authority recommends Betty. The Galactic Salvage Authority also recommends I pay them 40% of everything I find," Marcus interrupted, maneuvering the Lucky Strike closer to a particularly promising chunk of what looked like a command vessel. "And, since I'm operating in unregistered space, I think I'll stick to my own judgment." The wreckage was impressive, even by Marcus's standards. The ship had clearly been massive before whatever had destroyed it had turned it into an art installation of twisted metal and shattered crystal. The hull bore markings in a script he didn't recognize, all flowing curves and sharp angles that seemed to hurt his eyes if he looked at them too long. Marcus suited up and grabbed his cutting torch. The Lucky Strike's cargo bay was already half full of quality salvage from the outer edges of the debris field, but the good stuff was always in the command sections. That's where they kept the expensive electronics, the rare metals, and sometimes even personal effects that collectors on rim worlds would pay good money for. As he jetted across the void between his ship and the wreckage, Marcus couldn't help but admire the construction of the destroyed vessel. Whoever had built it knew their metallurgy. The hull plating was some kind of alloy that his scanner couldn't quite identify, and it had held together remarkably well considering the violence of whatever had destroyed the ship. The breach in the hull led into what had clearly been a ceremonial chamber of some kind. Marcus's headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing walls covered in more of those eye-watering symbols and what looked like religious artwork. At the center of the chamber sat a raised dais, and scattered around it were various objects that had clearly once been arranged with great care. "Now we're talking," Marcus muttered, beginning to collect the scattered items. Most of it was standard ceremonial gear, the kind of thing that anthropologists and collectors would pay decent money for. Crystalline vessels, metal sculptures with too many angles, and what looked like jewelry made from materials that definitely weren't from any planet Marcus had ever heard of. It was while he was carefully packing a particularly delicate crystal formation that he spotted the crown. It sat half hidden under a fallen beam, looking for all the world like someone had taken a piece of volcanic rock and tried to turn it into jewelry. The metal was dark, almost black, with veins of what looked like silver running through it in patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. It was roughly circular, with six-pointed projections that could generously be called spikes, though they were worn and rounded as if they were incredibly old. Marcus picked it up and turned it over in his gloved hands. It was heavier than it looked, and warm to the touch even through his suit's environmental systems. The metal felt strange, almost organic, but his scanner read it as some kind of dense alloy. The craftsmanship was excellent, whoever had made it clearly knew their trade, but it wasn't particularly impressive by galactic standards. He'd seen fancier jewelry in pawn shops on border worlds. Might be worth something to the right collector, he said to himself, dropping it into his salvage bag. Local religious artifact, probably. Always someone willing to pay for authentic cultural items. He spent another hour in the wreckage, collecting everything that looked valuable or interesting. By the time he jetted back to the Lucky Strike, his salvage bag was full and his mood was excellent. This had been a good day's work, and he was already mentally calculating how much the haul would bring on Kepler Station. Back aboard his ship, Marcus laid out his finds in the cargo bay for proper cataloging. Betty's sensors scanned each item, adding it to the ship's inventory with estimated values and potential buyers. The crown went into the miscellaneous cultural artifacts category with a modest estimated value of 200 credits. Betty, set course for Kepler Station, Marcus said, settling into his pilot's seat with a cup of coffee. Standard efficiency cruise, no hurry. Course plotted, Betty replied. Estimated travel time, 4 days, 6 hours. It was during the second day of travel that Marcus discovered the crown's most useful property. He was in the middle of preparing dinner when his portable camp stove started acting up again. The damn thing had been wobbly for weeks, one of the legs bent from when he'd dropped it during an EVA on his last salvage job. He'd been meaning to fix it, but the replacement parts cost more than the stove was worth, and Marcus had always been good at making do with what he had. The stove wobbled dangerously as he tried to heat up a package of reconstituted beef stew, threatening to spill the contents all over his tiny galley floor. Marcus looked around for something to prop it up with, and his eye fell on the crown sitting in the artifact bin. Perfect, he said, grabbing the crown and sliding it under the unsteady leg. The weight and shape were ideal, lifting the stove to exactly the right level and providing a stable base. As the stew heated, Marcus couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. Here he was, using what was probably some alien king's crown as a glorified shim for his camp stove. He wondered what the original owner would think of their precious royal regalia being used to heat up processed food in the galley of a human salvage ship. The crown performed admirably in its new role. The metal conducted heat well, keeping itself warm but not hot enough to damage the galley floor, and its weight meant the stove didn't shift at all during meal preparation. When he was done eating, Marcus left the crown where it was. After all, he'd probably need to cook again tomorrow. It wasn't until the third day of travel that he noticed the dreams. They started subtly, just vague impressions of vast spaces and ancient voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. Marcus had always been a vivid dreamer, so he didn't think much of it at first. Space travel could be boring, and his subconscious had always been good at entertaining itself during long hauls between stations. But the dreams grew more intense with each passing night. He began to see images of great cities built from black stone, their towers reaching impossibly high into alien skies. He saw vast armies marching under banners that bore the same eye-watering symbols he'd found in the wreckage, their armor gleaming with the same dark metal as the crown. And, always, in every dream, there was a presence. Something ancient and vast and angry, reaching out toward him across impossible distances. It spoke to him in voices like the grinding of continents, promising power beyond imagination if he would only listen, only submit, only kneel. Marcus's response was typically human. Betty, adjust the environmental controls, he said on the morning of the fourth day, rubbing his temples as he sat up in his bunk. I think the air recyclers are acting up again. Too much carbon dioxide makes me have weird dreams. Environmental systems are operating within normal parameters, Betty replied. All atmospheric readings are optimal for human habitation. Well, something's giving me the strangest dreams, Marcus muttered, heading for the galley to make his morning coffee. He stepped over the crown, still serving as a prop for his camp stove, without giving it a second glance. In the depths of space, ancient sensors that had watched the galaxy for eons registered something impossible. The crown of eternal night, the artifact that had driven civilizations to madness and war, the relic that had corrupted kings and toppled empires, was being used as furniture by a creature that seemed utterly immune to its influence. Deep in the void between galaxies, something that had slumbered for millennia began to stir. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen heated his coffee and wondered if Kepler Station would have any good replacement parts for camp stoves. The dreams that night were more vivid than ever. Marcus found himself standing in what could only be described as a throne room, though the architecture was like nothing human eyes had ever seen. The walls curved in impossible directions, and the ceiling seemed to stretch up forever into a darkness that was somehow darker than the absence of light. On a throne carved from what looked like crystallized shadow sat a figure that Marcus's mind refused to properly process. It was large, certainly larger than human, but its exact shape seemed to shift whenever he tried to focus on it. Sometimes it appeared to be wearing elaborate armor, sometimes flowing robes, and sometimes nothing at all except the fundamental wrongness that surrounded it like an aura. Finally, the figure spoke, and its voice was the sound of stars dying. After so long, a mind that can perceive me without immediately falling to madness. Do you know what you carry, little creature? Do you understand the power that rests in your insignificant hands? Marcus, still dreaming but, with the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes in dreams, looked around the throne room with mild interest. Nice place you've got here, he said. Bit dark for my taste, but I suppose that's a matter of personal preference. As for what I'm carrying, you must mean the crown. Found it in a debris field. Planning to sell it on Kepler Station if I can find the right buyer. The figure on the throne leaned forward, and Marcus felt rather than saw its attention focus on him like the weight of a collapsing star. Sell it? You would sell the crown of eternal night? The artifact that has consumed worlds? The relic that turned the Karzani Empire to ash and brought the Vrex Dominion to its knees? If the price is right, Marcus said pragmatically. Though honestly, I'm getting pretty good use out of it as a camp stove prop. Might keep it for that if I can't find a buyer who appreciates authentic cultural artifacts. There was a long silence in the throne room. When the figure spoke again, its voice carried a note of something that might have been bewilderment. You use the crown of eternal night as a prop for your cooking apparatus? Works great, Marcus said cheerfully. Heavy, stable, good heat distribution. Really, whoever made it knew their metallurgy. Is it getting warm in here? The dream faded as Marcus woke to the sound of Betty's morning alarm, leaving him with nothing but a vague memory of an interesting conversation with someone who had very strong opinions about crowns and seemed to take cooking equipment far too seriously. As he stumbled to the galley to make his coffee, Marcus stepped over the crown again, noting absently that it felt warmer than usual under his bare feet. Probably just conducted heat from the camp stove. He made a mental note to check if the stove's thermal regulation was working properly. He never noticed the way the silver veins in the crown's metal seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat, or the way the shadows in his galley seemed just a little darker than they should be. In the deepest reaches of space, ancient monitoring stations registered impossible readings. The crown of eternal night, an artifact of such malevolent power that entire star sectors had been evacuated rather than risk its influence, was being treated as a piece of camping equipment by a human trader who seemed completely oblivious to its true nature. Emergency signals began to propagate across the galaxy, traveling through networks that had been established when the universe was young. On a dozen worlds, beings of immense age and power felt the stirring of something that should have remained forever dormant. The crown of eternal night was active again. And, this time, its chosen vessel was a human who used it to heat his coffee. Marcus Chen, blissfully unaware that he had just become the focal point of galactic attention that would make the Battle of Koros Prime look like a minor disagreement, finished his coffee and settled into his pilot's seat to review the approach vectors for Kepler Station. In just over a day, he'd be docked and ready to turn his salvage into credits. It was shaping up to be a very profitable trip. Kepler Station hung in the void like a mechanical flower, its docking arms extended to embrace the steady stream of freighters, passenger vessels, and salvage ships that made it one of the busiest trading posts in the Outer Rim. Marcus Chen had been coming here for 3 years, ever since he'd scraped together enough credits to buy the Lucky Strike, and he knew the station like the back of his hand. What he didn't know was that his arrival had triggered the most comprehensive security alert in the station's 50-year history. Lucky Strike, this is Kepler Control, came the voice of the docking coordinator, though Marcus noticed she sounded more tense than usual. Please proceed to docking bay 77 Alpha and prepare for enhanced inspection procedures. Marcus frowned as he guided his ship toward the designated bay. Enhanced inspection usually meant either contraband smugglers or suspected terrorists, and he was definitely neither. His manifest was clean, his papers were in order, and he'd never had so much as a parking violation in station space. Enhanced inspection, Betty, he asked his ship's AI. What do you think that's about? Unknown, Betty replied. However, I am detecting unusual electromagnetic signatures from several vessels in nearby docking bays. The energy patterns are consistent with military-grade sensor arrays and weapons systems. Now Marcus was genuinely puzzled. Kepler Station was a free port, meaning military vessels were technically prohibited except in extreme circumstances. The fact that there were apparently multiple military ships docked meant something significant was happening, and he couldn't imagine what it had to do with his little salvage operation. As the Lucky Strike settled into the docking bay with a gentle thump of magnetic clamps, Marcus could see through the porthole that the bay was crowded with far more people than a routine customs inspection required. There had to be at least 20 figures in various types of armor and environmental suits, representing what looked like a half-dozen different species. Marcus Chen of the vessel Lucky Strike, came a new voice over the calm, this one carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. This is Commander Vex of the Galactic Security Council. Please exit your vessel slowly with your hands visible and prepare for immediate debriefing. The Galactic Security Council. Marcus whistled softly through his teeth. The GSC only got involved in matters of galactic security, things like rogue AI uprisings, dimensional breaches, or ancient weapons that could destroy solar systems. The fact that they were interested in his little salvage haul suggested he'd stumbled into something far more significant than he'd realized. Marcus made his way to the airlock, pausing only to grab the crown from where it still sat under his camp stove. If the GSC was interested in his salvage, they probably wanted to see everything he'd recovered from the debris field. He tucked the crown into his salvage bag along with a few other representative pieces from his haul. The airlock cycled, and Marcus stepped into what felt more like a military operation than a customs inspection. The docking bay had been cleared of all normal traffic, and portable barriers had been set up to create a secure perimeter. At the center of it all stood a figure that could only be Commander Vex. She was Altarian, Marcus realized, recognizing the distinctive blue-gray skin and the elaborate cranial ridges that marked her species as one of the galaxy's premier military cultures. She wore the dark uniform of the GSC with the easy confidence of someone who had earned her rank through competence rather than politics. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice carrying the same authority in person that it had over the calm thank you for your cooperation. I need you to understand that what we're about to discuss is classified at the highest levels of galactic security. Your willingness to assist in this matter will be noted and appreciated. Marcus set his salvage bag on a nearby table, noting how every eye in the docking bay immediately focused on it. Happy to help, Commander, but I have to admit I'm a little confused. I'm just a salvage operator. I pick up scrap metal and sell it to people who want scrap metal. I can't imagine what that has to do with galactic security. Commander Vex exchanged a glance with one of her subordinates, a tall insectoid being whose species Marcus didn't recognize. Mr. Chen, 3 days ago, long-range sensors detected the activation of an artifact known as the Crown of Eternal Night. The energy signature was tracked to this sector of space, and subsequent investigation revealed that you had recently operated in the debris field where the crown was last known to be located. The Crown of Eternal Night. Marcus reached into his salvage bag and pulled out the crown, noting how every security officer in the docking bay suddenly tensed. Several of them actually took involuntary steps backward, and he was pretty sure at least 2 had their hands on their weapons. This thing? Marcus asked, holding up the crown for examination. Ha! I found it in the wreckage of what looked like a ceremonial chamber. Been using it as a prop for my camp stove. Works great, actually. Really stable base. The silence in the docking bay was so complete that Marcus could hear the hum of the station's life support systems. Commander Vex stared at the crown in his hands with an expression that cycled through disbelief, horror, and what might have been professional fascination. You've been using the Crown of Eternal Night, she said slowly, as a prop for your camp stove. Like I said, works great. Heavy, stable, good heat distribution. Marcus turned the crown over in his hands, noting the way the security officers tracked its movement like they expected it to explode. I take it this thing is more valuable than I thought? The insectoid being stepped forward, its mandibles clicking in what Marcus recognized as agitation. Honored human, it said in accented standard, the crown of eternal night is perhaps the most dangerous artifact in known space. It is a relic of the Void Emperors, created in the dark times before the formation of the Galactic Council. Its influence has destroyed civilizations, driven entire species to madness, and consumed worlds in shadow and flame. Marcus looked down at the crown in his hands, then back at the assembled security officers. This thing? Are you sure we're talking about the same artifact? Because I've been carrying this around for 4 days, and the worst thing that's happened is some weird dreams. Weird dreams? Commander Vex leaned forward, her expression intent. Describe these dreams, Mr. Chen. In detail. Marcus shrugged. Just strange stuff. Big cities made of black stone, armies marching around, and some guy on a throne who seemed really upset about camp stoves. Oh, and he kept going on about power and submission and kneeling, but honestly, he seemed like kind of a drama queen. Very intense about everything. The silence that followed this description was even more profound than before. Marcus was beginning to feel like he'd walked into a galactic incident that he didn't understand, which was probably exactly what had happened. Mr. Chen, Commander Vex said carefully, the entity you describe is known as the Void Emperor Malachar. It is a being of immense malevolent power that was banished to the spaces between dimensions millennia ago. The Crown of Eternal Night was created as an anchor point for its influence, allowing it to corrupt and control anyone who comes into contact with it. Well, he seemed harmless enough, Marcus said. Bit full of himself, but who isn't? And, like I said, the crown makes an excellent camp stove prop. I'd hate to give up something that useful just because it's got some bad history. Commander Vex turned to her subordinates, and Marcus caught fragments of rapid conversation in multiple languages. Words like impossible and unprecedented featured prominently, along with what sounded like several different species versions of profanity. Finally, she turned back to Marcus. Mr. Chen, I need you to understand the magnitude of what you're dealing with. The Crown of Eternal Night has been responsible for the fall of the Karzani Empire, the corruption of the Vrex Dominion, and the destruction of the entire Terminus sector. Every being who has worn it has been driven to madness and transformed into an agent of the Void Emperor's will. Marcus looked down at the crown again. Should I not be touching it, then? I mean, I've been handling it pretty casually. According to every historical record, direct contact with the crown should have resulted in immediate corruption or death, the insectoid being said, its mandibles clicking rapidly. The fact that you remain apparently unaffected is unprecedented. Maybe I'm just lucky, Marcus suggested. Or maybe whoever wrote your historical records was exaggerating. You know how stories get embellished over time. Commander Vex pulled out a sophisticated-looking scanner and aimed it at the crown in Marcus's hands. The device immediately began emitting a series of urgent beeps and flashing lights that suggested it was detecting something significant. The artifact is definitely active, she said, reading the scanner's display. Energy output is consistent with historical records of the crown during periods of active influence. But she looked up at Marcus with puzzlement. The corruption field that should be emanating from it appears to be contained somehow. Marcus held the crown up to the light, examining it with new interest. Contained how? That's what we need to find out. Commander Vex gestured to her team. Mr. Chen, I'm going to need you to come with us for a full debriefing and examination. This situation is beyond anything in our protocols. Will I get my crown back? Marcus asked. I mean, if it's not actually dangerous to me specifically, I'd like to keep using it for my camp stove. It really does work better than anything else I've tried. The look on Commander Vex's face suggested that this was not the response she had been expecting from someone holding one of the galaxy's most feared artifacts. The debriefing took place in one of Kepler Station's high-security conference rooms, a space designed to contain anything from diplomatic negotiations to interrogations of captured terrorists. Marcus found himself seated at a metal table across from Commander Vex and a small army of specialists representing various galactic intelligence agencies. Dr. Ythera, a crystalline whose translucent body pulsed with soft light, was the first to break the silence. Mr. Chen, we've conducted every scan known to galactic science, and, according to our instruments, you should be either dead or completely dominated by the Void Emperor's will. Instead, you appear to be a perfectly normal human trader with no signs of corruption or external influence." "That's good to hear," Marcus said. "I was starting to worry that carrying around an ancient evil artifact might be bad for my health." "It should be," Dr. Yithra replied, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested deep confusion. "The Crown of Eternal Night operates by exploiting the fundamental psychological structures that govern sentient consciousness. It offers power in exchange for submission, glory in exchange for corruption, and dominion in exchange for the soul. Every species we've studied has basic psychological frameworks that make them vulnerable to this type of influence." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And you think humans might be different somehow?" "We're beginning to suspect that might be the case," Commander Vex interjected. "Tell me, Mr. Chen, when the entity in your dreams offered you power, what was your response?" Marcus thought back to his conversations with the dramatic figure on the throne. "Well, mostly I just found him kind of annoying. I mean, he kept going on and on about eternal dominion and consuming worlds and all that, but honestly, it sounded like a lot of work. I've got a business to run." The specialists exchanged glances. Dr. Yithra's crystalline form brightened noticeably. "You found the Void Emperor annoying?" "Very much so," Marcus confirmed. "He had this whole elaborate speech prepared about how I would become his vessel for returning to the physical realm, but he never really explained what was in it for me. I mean, conquering the galaxy sounds impressive, but what's the actual benefit? Who's going to buy my salvage if everyone's dead or enslaved?" Commander Vex leaned back in her chair, looking like someone who was rapidly revising everything she thought she knew about galactic security. "Mr. Chen, you've just articulated the fundamental weakness in the Void Emperor's corruption strategy. It offers power and dominion, but it assumes that power and dominion are inherently desirable to the target consciousness." "And they're not?" Marcus asked. "Not to humans, apparently," Dr. Yithra said, her form pulsing with what might have been excitement. "Or at least, not to you specifically. Your species appears to have a psychological framework that evaluates offers of power based on practical considerations rather than emotional appeal." Marcus considered this. "That seems reasonable. I mean, power is only useful if it helps you accomplish your goals. If your goal is just to run a successful salvage business, then conquering the galaxy is actually counterproductive. Hard to maintain customer relationships when you're a Dark Emperor." The room fell silent again. Marcus was beginning to think that maybe his perspective on ancient evil artifacts was more unusual than he'd realized. "Mr. Chen," Commander Vex said finally, "I believe you may have inadvertently discovered something that could change our understanding of void corruption entirely. Would you be willing to participate in some additional tests?" "Under controlled conditions, of course." "Will I get to keep my crown?" Marcus asked. "I've still got dinner to make tonight, and I haven't found anything that works as well as a camp stove prop." Commander Vex looked at the crown sitting innocuously on the table between them, its dark metal gleaming under the conference room's lights. Somewhere in the depths of space, ancient powers were stirring, drawn by the impossible situation of their most potent weapon being used as camping equipment. "Mr. Chen," she said slowly, "I think that might be exactly what we need you to do." Outside the conference room, emergency communications were being sent to the highest levels of galactic government. The Crown of Eternal Night was active, but its wielder appeared to be completely immune to its influence. More importantly, he seemed to be actively diminishing its power simply by treating it as an ordinary object. For the first time in galactic history, an ancient weapon of mass destruction was being successfully contained by someone who refused to take it seriously. And Marcus Chen still had no idea that he'd just become the most important human in the galaxy. The testing facility on Kepler Station had been hastily converted from a xenobiology lab into something that could safely contain what the galaxy's foremost experts were calling the human anomaly. Marcus Chen sat in the center of a circle of sensors, monitors, and very nervous scientists, holding the crown of eternal night in his lap like a particularly interesting piece of scrap metal. Dr. Yithra's crystalline form flickered through several different colors as she monitored the crown's energy output. "Fascinating," she murmured, her harmonic voice filled with scientific excitement. "The corruption field is definitely active, but it's somehow being neutralized by proximity to Mr. Chen's consciousness. Marcus looked down at the crown. To his eyes, it looked exactly the same as it had when he'd first found it in the debris field. Dark metal with silver veins, a little warm to the touch, and heavy enough to make an excellent camp stove prop. Is it doing anything I should be worried about? According to these readings, it should be rewriting your fundamental personality structure, Dr. Yithara replied. Instead, it appears to be. I'm not sure how to describe this. The corruption field keeps attempting to establish a connection with your consciousness, but each attempt fails and the field becomes slightly weaker. Commander Vex studied the readouts on her portable terminal. How much weaker? Approximately 3% reduction in overall potency since we began monitoring, Dr. Yithara said. If this rate continues, the crown could be rendered completely inert within standard galactic months. The implications of this hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus, oblivious to the historical significance of what was happening, shifted the crown to a more comfortable position and wondered if the station's cafeteria served anything better than reconstituted protein bars. Dr. Yithara, Commander Vex said, what happens if the crown's power is completely neutralized? The crystalline scientist's form brightened with excitement. Theoretically, the connection between the crown and the Void Emperor would be severed. Without an anchor point in this dimension, Malachar would be unable to exert any influence on our reality. Marcus perked up at this. So if I keep carrying it around, this Void Emperor guy will eventually leave me alone? That would be nice. His whole doom and gloom routine is getting old. You're still having contact with the entity? Commander Vex asked sharply. Every night, Marcus confirmed. Though he seemed kind of subdued lately. Less bow before my infinite power and more please stop using my crown as camping equipment. To be honest, I'm starting to feel a little bad for him. The security officers in the room exchanged alarmed glances. Feeling sympathy for one of the galaxy's most dangerous entities was not a reaction that appeared in any of their training manuals. Dr. Yithara leaned forward, her crystalline facets catching the light as she focused on Marcus. Mr. Chen, could you describe your most recent interaction with the Void Emperor in detail? Marcus thought back to the previous night's dream. Well, he seemed smaller somehow. And his throne room wasn't as impressive. Some of the walls were actually showing wear, like the whole place was falling apart. When he tried to do his usual speech about eternal dominion, his voice cracked a little. It was actually kind of sad. The realm is degrading, Dr. Yithara whispered, her form pulsing with amazement. The Void Emperor's power is so tied to the crown that as the artifact weakens, his entire dimensional pocket is beginning to collapse. Commander Vex activated her communicator. Priority transmission to GSC command. The crown neutralization is having effects beyond our initial projections. Request immediate consultation with the Dimensional Sciences Division. While the adults talked in urgent whispers about things that sounded very important, Marcus continued to examine the crown. Now that he was looking more carefully, he could see that the silver veins in the metal did seem less bright than they had been a few days ago. The overall color of the artifact had shifted from deep black to more of a charcoal gray, and the surface felt less warm to the touch. Is this thing dying? He asked, interrupting a particularly intense discussion between Dr. Yithara and a Kelleran physicist whose name Marcus hadn't caught. In a sense, yes, Dr. Yithara replied. The crown is an artifact of pure malevolent will given physical form. Your complete rejection of its intended purpose is causing it to lose cohesion at a fundamental level. Marcus held the crown up to the light, watching the way the faded silver veins caught the illumination. That's actually kind of tragic. I mean, whoever made this thing put a lot of work into it. The craftsmanship is really impressive, even if the purpose was questionable. You feel sorry for it? Commander Vex asked, her tone suggesting this was yet another unprecedented response. A little, Marcus admitted. It's like watching a piece of art deteriorate because nobody appreciates it properly. I mean, yes, it's supposed to be an evil weapon of mass destruction, but it's also a beautifully made piece of metalwork. Seems like a waste. The crown in his hands pulsed once, very gently, and Marcus could have sworn he felt something that might have been gratitude flow through the metal. Around the testing chamber, monitoring equipment registered a brief spike in energy that had no correlation with any known form of void corruption. Dr. Ythera's crystalline form went completely clear with shock. Mr. Chen, the crown just responded to your emotional state. But, not in any way that matches its documented behavior patterns. What do you mean? It reacted to your sympathy, she said, her harmonic voice filled with wonder. For the first time in its recorded history, the crown of eternal night responded to compassion rather than ambition. Marcus looked down at the artifact with new interest. You know, it just occurred to me. What if this thing isn't actually evil? What if it's just been misunderstood? The suggestion caused such a stir among the assembled scientists and security officers that Commander Vex had to call for order. When the hubbub died down, she fixed Marcus with the kind of stare usually reserved for people who suggested that black holes might be good for tourism. Mr. Chen, the crown of eternal night has destroyed civilizations. Has it, though? Marcus asked thoughtfully. Or have people destroyed civilizations while using the crown as an excuse? I mean, from what you've told me, this thing offers power to people who want power. But, what happens if you give it to someone who doesn't want power? Dr. Ythera's form shifted through a rapid spectrum of colors. The historical records show that every previous bearer of the crown became corrupted and, she stopped mid-sentence, her crystalline structure brightening with sudden understanding. Oh. Oh my. What is it? Commander Vex demanded. Every previous bearer, Dr. Ythera said slowly, sought out the crown because they desired its power. They came to it with ambition, greed, or desperation. Mr. Chen is the first person in recorded history to acquire the crown by accident and treat it as an ordinary object. Marcus nodded. That makes sense. If you go looking for a weapon, you'll probably use it as a weapon. But, if you just need something to prop up your camp stove. He shrugged. The crown pulsed again, and this time everyone in the room felt it. Not as the oppressive wave of malevolent energy described in the historical records, but as something gentler. Something that might have been loneliness, or even hope. Commander, Dr. Ythera said urgently, I'm reading massive changes in the crown's energy matrix. The void corruption is being replaced by something else entirely. Replaced by what? I'm not sure. The energy signature is unlike anything in our databases. Dr. Ythera's form flickered rapidly as she processed the incoming data. If I didn't know better, I'd say the crown is trying to change its fundamental purpose. Marcus felt the crown grow warmer in his hands, and, suddenly, the dreams from the past few nights made a different kind of sense. I think it wants to be useful, he said quietly. Not powerful, just useful. Like any tool should be. In the depths of his collapsing dimensional realm, the Void Emperor Malachar felt something he had never experienced in eons of existence: uncertainty. The crown that had been his anchor to the physical universe was changing, transformed by contact with a consciousness that refused to play by any of the established rules. Through the crown's connection, he could sense the human's thoughts. There was no hunger for power, no desire for dominion, no fear of death or corruption. Instead, there was something infinitely more alien to his ancient understanding: contentment. The human was satisfied with his small ship, his simple life, his modest ambitions. When offered the power to rule galaxies, he worried about maintaining customer relationships. When presented with ancient knowledge that could rewrite the laws of reality, he wondered if it would help him find better replacement parts for his camp stove. It was, the Void Emperor realized, the most thoroughly incomprehensible worldview he had ever encountered. And, it was killing him. Not quickly, not dramatically, but, with the slow inexorability of water wearing away stone. Each moment of contact with the human's utterly reasonable perspective weakened the foundations of power and ambition upon which his existence was built. For the first time since his banishment, Malachar found himself considering the possibility that he might have been wrong about everything. Back in the testing chamber, Marcus stood up and stretched, still holding the crown casually in one hand. Well, this has been educational, but I should probably get back to my ship. I've got a delivery to make on Titan 7, and the customer is expecting their spare parts by next week. Mr. Chen, Commander Vex said carefully, you can't just leave. You're carrying one of the most significant artifacts in galactic history. And I'm using it to prop up my camp stove, Marcus replied reasonably. It seems to be working out fine for everyone involved.
Dr. Ythera's crystalline form pulsed with sudden urgency. "Commander, the dimensional readings are spiking. Something is happening in the Void Emperor's realm."
Through the crown, Marcus felt rather than heard a voice that had once commanded the fear of entire star systems. But now it sounded tired, and perhaps a little lost. "Human," the Void Emperor said, and for the first time his voice carried no menace, only curiosity.
"What are you?"
Marcus, standing in a testing chamber surrounded by the galaxy's most advanced technology and brightest minds, answered with characteristic directness.
"I'm just a guy trying to make a living." In his collapsing throne room, the Void Emperor Malachar began to laugh.
It was not the terrible laughter of conquest or corruption, but something simpler and more human. It was the laughter of someone who had finally gotten the joke. The emergency session of the Galactic Security Council was the largest gathering of its kind in over 2 centuries. Representatives from every major civilization sat in the vast amphitheater on Nexus Prime, their attention focused on the holographic display at the center of the chamber. The display showed a single human sitting in what appeared to be a ship's galley, using an ancient artifact of immense power to support a camping stove while he heated up soup. Admiral Kess of the Altarian fleet leaned forward in her seat. "Commander Vex, please explain to the Council how one human salvage operator has managed to accomplish what our combined military forces could not achieve in 1,000 years of containment protocols." Commander Vex stood at the center of the amphitheater, her blue-gray skin showing the stress marks that indicated she had been dealing with unprecedented situations for far too long. "Honored counselors, the situation continues to evolve in ways that challenge our fundamental understanding of void corruption. Mr. Chen has now been in contact with the Crown of Eternal Night for 8 standard days. During this time, the artifact's power has decreased by approximately 40%.
A ripple of shocked conversation ran through the assembly.
The Kelleran representative, her crystalline body flickering with agitation, raised a limb for attention.
"Commander, are you saying that this human is destroying the crown?"
"Not exactly," Commander Vex replied. "Based on our observations and Dr. Ythera's analysis, Mr. Chen is causing the crown to transform.
Its fundamental nature is changing from a tool of corruption to something else entirely." The holographic display shifted to show energy readings from the past week.
Where the crown's signature had once been a chaotic maelstrom of malevolent force, it now showed patterns that resembled nothing so much as the steady, purposeful energy output of a well-designed tool. Senator Vorthak of the Draconian Empire, his scaled features twisted with skepticism, spoke in his characteristic rumble.
"And what, exactly, is this human transforming our most feared enemy into?"
"A camp stove prop, sir," Commander Vex replied with professional composure.
The silence that followed this statement was broken only by the soft humming of the amphitheater's environmental systems.
Finally, the Council's presiding officer, an ancient being whose species had been extinct for millennia before humans had learned to use fire, spoke in a voice like grinding stone.
"Explain." Commander Vex activated another hologram, this one showing the interior of Marcus Chen's ship.
The human in question was visible preparing his evening meal, the Crown of Eternal Night sitting under his portable stove exactly as it had been for the past week. "Mr. Chen treats the crown as a practical object rather than a symbol of power," she explained. "This pragmatic approach appears to be causing the artifact to adapt to its new role.
Instead of channeling void corruption, it now channels thermal regulation and structural stability." The Kelleran representative's crystalline form brightened with sudden understanding. "The crown is learning to be useful rather than powerful." "That appears to be correct," Commander Vex confirmed. "And the transformation is accelerating.
Our latest readings suggest that within another week, the crown will be completely inert as a weapon but fully optimized as camping equipment."
Admiral Kess rubbed her cranial ridges in the Altarian gesture of bewilderment. "Commander, what are the implications of this transformation? What happens to the Void Emperor if his anchor to our reality becomes a piece of hiking gear?" Before Commander Vex could answer, every screen in the amphitheater flickered and went dark.
When they came back online, they showed not the familiar image of Marcus Chen's galley, but a figure that caused every being in the chamber to instinctively recoil. The Void Emperor Malachar stood before them, but he was not as the historical records described him. Gone were the elaborate robes of shadow and the crown of crystallized darkness. Instead, he wore what appeared to be, "I come to you not as an enemy, but as someone seeking employment. The chaos that erupted in the chamber was immediate and comprehensive. Security alarms wailed, emergency protocols activated, and half the representatives were on their feet demanding everything from immediate evacuation to nuclear bombardment of the entire system. The ancient presiding officer raised one withered appendage, and gradually order was restored. "Speak," it commanded simply. Malachar nodded respectfully. "For eons, I have existed as a force of pure ambition and corruption, seeking to dominate and consume. But contact with the human Marcus Chen has shown me the fundamental flaw in this approach. Power without purpose is meaningless. Dominion without utility is waste." Senator Vorthak's scaled features showed the confusion of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged. "You're saying that one human convinced you to abandon your goals of galactic conquest?" "He didn't convince me of anything," Malachar replied with what might have been amusement. "He simply demonstrated that there are better ways to be useful. When I offered him the power to rule the galaxy, he asked what the practical benefits would be for his salvage business. When I promised him eternal dominion, he worried about maintaining customer relationships." The Kelleran representative flickered through several colors before settling on a pale blue that indicated deep thoughtfulness. "And this changed your perspective, how?" "It forced me to examine what I actually wanted," Malachar said. "I realized that what I had always interpreted as a desire for power was actually a desire to be necessary, to be valued. But there are many ways to be necessary that don't involve conquering civilizations." Admiral Kess leaned forward, her military bearing evident even in her confusion. "What are you proposing?" Malachar's form seemed to straighten with something that resembled professional pride. "I am offering my services to the Galactic Council as a consultant on matters of ancient technology and dimensional phenomena. My experience with void energies and artifact creation could be useful in dealing with other dangerous relics. In exchange, I ask only for the opportunity to learn more constructive applications for my abilities." The presiding officer's ancient eyes fixed on the transformed Void Emperor. "And your connection to the crown?" Evolving, Malachar replied. "As the crown becomes more useful as a tool, our connection becomes less about domination and more about collaboration. I find that I enjoy being helpful rather than feared." Commander Vex, who had been quietly monitoring her instruments throughout this unprecedented exchange, looked up with surprise. "Sir, the dimensional readings are stabilizing. The void realm isn't collapsing anymore. It appears to be restructuring itself." "Into what?" the presiding officer demanded. "Based on these energy patterns," Commander Vex said, consulting her scanner with professional bewilderment, "it looks like it's becoming some kind of workshop." On his ship, blissfully unaware that he had just facilitated the first peaceful transformation of a galactic threat in recorded history, Marcus Chen finished his soup and began washing his dishes. The crown sat under his camp stove, warm and stable, doing exactly what he needed it to do. In his dreams that night, Marcus found himself not in a throne room but in what appeared to be a well-organized machine shop. Malachar was there, but instead of elaborate robes he wore practical work clothes and was examining what looked like blueprints for improved camping equipment. "Human," Malachar said without looking up from his work, "I've been thinking about your camp stove situation. The crown is an excellent prop, but I believe I could design something even better. Perhaps an integrated heating and stabilization system that would fold down for easy storage?" Marcus examined the blueprints with interest. "That's not a bad idea. Would it work with standard power cells?" "I was thinking more along the lines of thermal taps directly into dimensional energy," Malachar replied. "Unlimited power source, completely clean, and the whole unit would weigh less than your current stove." "Now that sounds useful," Marcus said approvingly. "What would you want in return?" Malachar paused in his work, and, when he looked up, his expression was almost shy. "I was hoping you might let me tag along on some of your salvage runs. I haven't seen the physical universe in quite some time, and I think I might enjoy traveling to new places." Marcus considered this. "Well, I could use someone who knows about ancient technology. Half the stuff I find, I can't even identify. Would you be willing to help with cargo loading?" "I would consider it an honor," Malachar replied with evident sincerity. When Marcus woke the next morning, he found a small device sitting next to the crown. It looked like a more sophisticated version of his camp stove, sleek and efficient, with controls that seemed almost intuitive. A note beside it, written in script that seemed to shift and flow as he looked at it, read, "A prototype. Let me know what you think." Marcus set up the new stove and found that it worked exactly as advertised. Lightweight, efficient, and stable enough that he didn't need a prop at all. The crown sat nearby, still warm, but somehow it felt different. Less like an ancient weapon and more like a comfortable old tool that had found its proper place in the world. He made his coffee and settled in to plan his next salvage run. According to his charts, there was an interesting debris field about 3 days' travel from Kepler Station, the remnants of an ancient colony ship that had been lost for centuries. It sounded like exactly the kind of job that would benefit from having an expert in ancient technology along for the ride. Marcus picked up the crown and examined it one more time. The silver veins had brightened again, but now they pulsed with a warm, steady light that reminded him of a healthy heartbeat. Whatever this thing had been originally, it was becoming something new. Something useful. And, in the grand scheme of the galaxy, that might just be the most revolutionary transformation of all. 6 months later, Marcus Chen was beginning to think that having a reformed galactic threat as a business partner was the best decision he'd ever made. The Lucky Strike had been upgraded extensively, though most of the improvements were invisible to the casual observer. Malachar had a talent for dimensional engineering that made standard ship modifications look like crude hammerwork. The cargo hold now had 3 times its original capacity thanks to carefully folded space, the life support system tapped into dimensional energy sources that would never need refueling, and the navigation computer had access to star charts that predated most known civilizations. What was visible was the dramatic improvement in Marcus's salvage operation. His ship now carried sophisticated scanning equipment that could identify valuable artifacts from light years away, and his manifest database included detailed information about technologies that most galactic museums would kill for. The crown of eternal night sat in its customary place in the galley, though its role had evolved considerably. What had once been a simple camp stove prop was now the central component of the ship's domestic systems. It regulated temperature, managed power distribution for the galley equipment, and even served as a communication hub for Malachar's dimensional workshop. Marcus was examining the readings from their latest scan when a familiar presence settled into his consciousness. The mental contact that had once carried overtones of ancient malice now felt more like getting a call from an enthusiastic colleague. "Marcus," Malachar's voice echoed in his mind, "you need to see what I've found in the Andromeda debris field. There's a derelict ship here that's carrying what appears to be a complete architect installation." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. The architects were one of the galaxy's great mysteries, an ancient race that had built massive installations throughout known space before vanishing without trace. Their technology was so advanced that most species couldn't even understand what it was supposed to do, let alone how to use it. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked, setting down his cup and heading for the pilot's seat. Architect tech is supposed to be practically impossible to salvage. Most of it self-destructs if you look at it wrong. "That's because most salvagers approach it as technology to be understood," Malachar replied, his mental voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had solved a particularly interesting puzzle. "But, if you treat it as an artifact to be preserved, it becomes much more cooperative." Marcus shook his head in amazement. Even after 6 months of partnership, Malachar's ability to see familiar problems from completely new angles continued to surprise him. "What do you think it's worth?" "To the right collector?" "Probably enough to buy a small planet," Malachar said. "But, I have a better idea. The installation is a fabrication matrix, designed to create tools and equipment according to program specifications. If we can convince it to work with us instead of trying to dissect it, we could revolutionize your salvage operation." Marcus considered this. His business had always been successful because he could find things other people missed, but the idea of being able to create exactly what his customers needed rather than hoping to find it in debris fields was appealing. "What would we need to do?" "The same thing we did with my crown," Malachar replied. "Treat it with respect, find a useful purpose for it, and convince it that cooperation is more rewarding than resistance." An hour later, Marcus was floating in his environmental suit next to what had to be the most beautiful piece of technology he'd ever seen. The architect installation was a sphere roughly the size of a shuttlecraft, its surface covered in patterns that seemed to flow like liquid metal. Unlike most ancient artifacts, which tended to look impressive but static, this one was clearly alive with some form of consciousness. "Hello," Marcus said, placing a gloved hand on the sphere's surface. "I'm Marcus Chen, and this is my partner Malachar. We're salvage operators, and we're wondering if you'd like a job." The patterns on the sphere's surface stilled for a moment, then began moving in what Marcus had learned to recognize as the technological equivalent of surprise. A voice, clearly artificial but somehow warm, spoke directly into his mind. "You wish to employ me?" "If you're interested," Marcus replied. "We could use someone who's good at making things, and, from what Malachar tells me, you're the best fabricator in the galaxy. The work would involve creating custom equipment for various clients, mostly legitimate businesses and research institutions." "You do not wish to study my internal structure or reverse engineer my capabilities?" Marcus glanced at Malachar, whose form had materialized beside him in the vacuum of space. The former Void Emperor looked like a cross between a technician and a diplomat, professional but approachable. "Not unless you wanted us to," Marcus said. "We've found that forcing people to do things they don't want to do is generally bad for business relationships." The architect installation was silent for a long moment, its patterns flowing in what might have been deep thought. Finally, it spoke again, and this time its voice carried a note of something that sounded very much like relief. "I have been alone for 17,000 years, it said. The last of my creators died before the current galactic civilization achieved spaceflight. I have spent all that time maintaining myself and waiting for someone to activate me, but everyone who found me wanted only to take me apart or use me as a weapon." "Well, we're definitely not interested in weapons," Marcus said firmly. "We're more in the business of making people's lives easier." "Would that be the kind of work you'd enjoy?" "I was designed to create things that bring joy and utility to conscious beings," the installation replied, its patterns brightening noticeably. "It has been a very long time since I was able to fulfill that purpose." Malachar stepped forward, his form radiating the kind of gentle authority that came from eons of experience. "What would you need to function at full capacity?" "Raw materials, power sources, and creative input from beings who understand what they need," the installation said immediately. "And, perhaps, companionship? I was never intended to work in isolation." Marcus smiled inside his helmet. "I think we can manage all of that. Malachar here is excellent with power sources, we salvage raw materials for a living, and, as for companionship..." He gestured to the crown visible through the Lucky Strike's viewports. "You wouldn't be the first ancient artifact to find a new purpose with our operation." The installation's pattern shifted to what Marcus was learning to recognize as excitement. "The energy signature from your ship is familiar. You carry a transformed void construct. How remarkable. I had theorized that such transformations were possible, but I never expected to see one. The crown used to belong to me," Malachar said with evident pride. "Marcus helped me understand that being useful is more satisfying than being feared." "And now you work together as partners?" "Equal partners," Marcus confirmed. "Malachar handles the technical aspects of our operation, I manage the business side, and we both contribute to strategic planning. It's worked out well for everyone involved." The installation was quiet for another moment, then its surface began to glow with a warm, steady light. "I would very much like to join your partnership. What shall I call myself in this new role?" Marcus thought about it. Throughout galactic history, ancient artifacts were given names that reflected their power or their origins. But this was a new kind of partnership, one based on mutual respect rather than dominance. "What would you like to be called?" he asked. The installation's pattern shifted through several configurations before settling into something that looked almost like a smile. "I have always been fond of the name Ada. It was what my first creator called me, in the early days when I was learning to understand the joy of making useful things." "Ada it is," Marcus said, shaking hands with empty space in the formal gesture of sealing a business agreement. "Welcome to Chen Salvage and Applied Technologies." 6 hours later, the Lucky Strike was heading back to Kepler Station with its newest crew members safely installed in what had once been the ship's secondary cargo bay. Ada had immediately begun optimizing the ship's systems, creating improved versions of everything from the coffee maker to the navigation computer. Her enthusiasm for useful work was infectious, and Marcus found himself looking forward to seeing what their new partnership could accomplish. The Crown sat in its usual place in the galley, now serving as a communication hub that kept all three partners connected across dimensional and digital spaces. What had once been an instrument of corruption had become the foundation of what might be the most unusual but effective business partnership in galactic history. Marcus, Malakar's voice carried a note of satisfaction as it echoed through the Crown's connection.
I've been monitoring the galactic news feeds. We're not the only ones taking a new approach to ancient artifacts.
Marcus looked up from the fabrication request he'd been reviewing.
What do you mean?
3 other void constructs have contacted the Galactic Security Council requesting employment opportunities, Malakar explained. Apparently, word is spreading through the dimensional networks that transformation is possible. There's even talk of establishing a formal rehabilitation program for corrupted artifacts. Ada's mechanical voice joined the conversation through the ship's communication system. I have detected similar interest among other architect installations. Several have activated and begun broadcasting signals that indicate a desire for purposeful employment rather than passive preservation. Marcus leaned back in his pilot's seat, looking out at the stars ahead. In the span of 6 months, he'd gone from a simple salvage operator to the founder of what appeared to be a new model for dealing with ancient technologies. Instead of treating powerful artifacts as objects to be contained or exploited, they were discovering that these ancient creations could be partners, colleagues, even friends. You know, Marcus said thoughtfully, I think we might be onto something bigger than just a salvage business.
A consulting service for technological integration?
Ada suggested.
We could help other civilizations establish productive relationships with ancient artifacts. A rehabilitation network for transformed entities, Malakar added.
Providing support and purpose for beings who want to move beyond their original programming.
Marcus nodded, watching the stars wheel past the viewports.
Shen Salvage and Applied Technologies, specializing in turning ancient threats into useful partners.
Has a nice ring to it. The Crown pulsed with warm agreement, its silver veins bright with contentment.
What had begun as a chance encounter in a debris field had become something unprecedented in galactic history, proof that even the most dangerous ancient powers could find new purpose when treated with respect, understanding, and the simple recognition that everyone, even ancient evils, wanted to be useful. As the Lucky Strike continued its journey toward Kepler Station, its crew of human, former Void Emperor, and architect fabricator began planning their next venture. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, ancient artifacts that had spent millennia as objects of fear or worship were beginning to stir with the possibility that they too might find a better way to exist. And it all started because Marcus Chen needed something to prop up his camp stove. In the end, that might be the most human solution of all, taking the galaxy's most complicated problems and solving them with practical engineering, mutual respect, and a willingness to see potential partners where others saw only threats. The universe was about to become a much more interesting place.